greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Hello, my Micto brothers, back again for another episode of Feminized America. This is going to be a special edition of Feminized America. When I do these series, I like to give practical situations when I can. And this is a hot topic because it exemplifies exactly what I've been talking about. This is a case where a law is invented by a government for its own needs. Made up facts, made up constituencies, a made up case study to galvanize a policy put in place for whatever reason. Since I predict that this is going to be a long video, what I'm going to do for the folks out there with a short attention span who can't sit through a long video, I'm going to do my analysis up front, and then I'm going to give the evidence afterward, so that if all you want is the analysis and all you want is the overview, if you will, it's going to be within, I say, the first 5 to 6 minutes. And then there's going to be, I would say, almost 30 minutes of material behind it. So if you want to just hear the analysis and what I think, I'm going to do that now. And then if you want to see what the supporting material is, I'm going to put that behind it. I tried to edit it down to where it was shortened, but since it was such a good article and it was so rich with material, I couldn't figure out what parts to cut out because I thought it was all very necessary and all pertinent, especially to what's going on now. In this episode, we're going to look at how they use Title IX to make yes means yes a policy. And we're going to examine the parallels between how they used quasi-constituency to implement and pass Title IX and how they use a quasi-constituency and a quasi example or case to make yes means yes a policy. I'm going to look at this from what I believe the policymakers looked at. We're going to use something from the last two videos, population pyramid, and show how the same factors of population were forming and how they went to their old playbook to implement a policy to solve what they perceived as a coming problem. We're going to be using a couple of resources. One is a article from Christina Hoff Sommers, and the other is an audio series from NPR that was developed by NPR and the Center for Public Integrity, CPI, which put out a 104-page booklet about rape culture. And we're going to show how this was used to make the yes means yes policy. So with that, we're going to get into our analysis right now. Now, if you remember from a previous video, we left off at the year of 1970, just before Title IX was introduced and the other feminist laws came in, like no-fault divorce and a few other things. But if you go back to the end of that video, we talked about what the population of the United States looked like in 1970. If you go back through the video, you can see that the baby boomers, which lie right around here where this circle is, were half of them were in their 20s, and the other half hadn't even come into their what we call their prime, or their arms bearing years and baby making years. So this is the landscape that our policymakers looked at back there in the 1970. And it's the reason I believe that feminist socialization policy called equity was implemented. Now, the next slide, you see the same chart, you see the same pyramid side by side with one that's 15 years later. You can see how the bulges moved up. Well, the interesting part that I wanted to point out, that while the bulges moved up and you can see all the baby boomers are adults now in comparison to the older generation, but the interesting part is that this is when the baby boomers started to have children. Now you can see the big divide between the baby boomers and Generation X. And what's interesting is you can see the boomlet, or the children of the baby boomers, form down here. This is the leading edge of it. So the policymakers can already see another similar pattern forming that you saw back in 1950. You can see by the year 2000, it's apparent the three different blocks of population in the United States. Baby boomers are getting older. This is your Gen Y, or the in-between stage. These were the silent majority back in the 50s. And here are the boomlets. This is the second largest group of children ever born in the United States. And by the year 2000, you can see how clearly they're defined. They're between the ages of 5 and 20. So this is basically, the year 2000 is basically the same setup that you saw in 1960. So it's 1960 all over again. By 2010, it's evident that the Gen Y, or the millennial boomlets, have all reached what we call the arms bearing years and baby making years, or baby bearing years. So you have a mini version of what the boomers were like back in 1970. So this is almost a repeat of 1970. So what would you expect? You would expect that there'll be a repeat of the policies that happened in 1970. You would expect the same atmosphere in the late 2000s, which happened, with the Arab Spring and over here the Occupy Wall Street. So it's a mini version, or a lighter version, of what happened in the 60s and in the 70s. So they're basically going back to their old playbook. Now that we have talked about the underlying environment that may have prompted these draconian third wave feminist policies we now find ourselves up against, we're going to dive into what I believe is the source of these policies, the seed, if you will. In 2010, the Center for Public Integrity published a digital news book called Sexual Assault on Campus: A Frustrating Search for Justice. And in this 104-page news book, it highlighted the case of Laura Dunn. In 2004, Laura Dunn was a freshman and a member of the crew team at the University of Wisconsin. On the evening of April 4th, 2004, Dunn was at a crew team party where she consumed so many raspberry vodkas that the student bartenders refused to give her more drinks. According to Dunn, she left with two young men she trusted from the crew team. They had planned to go to another party, but decided to make a quick stop at one of their apartments. Once there, according to Dunn, she was raped by her two male companions. 15 months later, after reflecting on the incident, she walked into the Dean of Students' office and reported the rape. After a 9-month investigation, by the dean of students, campus police, and the local police, the case was dropped because of insufficient evidence and conflicting testimony. Ms. Dunn then filed a claim with the Office of Civil Rights under the Title IX law against sexual assault. After almost 2 years of investigation, the Office of Civil Rights found that the school had acted appropriately and dropped the case also. The CPI used Laura Dunn's story to assert that colleges and universities were allowing serial predators to run wild and terrorize millions of young college co-eds. They also used the story to accuse the Office of Civil Rights for not enforcing Title IX and accuse them of being a useless and feckless watchdog and leaving female students at risk of being re-victimized by their attackers. National Public Radio picked up this story and decided to do a news series on Laura Dunn's case and how universities and the federal government were handling it. It created a frenzied sensation that spread like wildfire. NPR and CPI in 2010 won numerous accolades and awards for the piece that they did. After the NPR piece made such a splash, a little-known education official, Rosalind Ali, who was head of the Office of Civil Rights Department and in charge of enforcing Title IX, got a hold of this story, and it galvanized her into changing the way the Office of Civil Rights prosecutes these cases. When NPR presented her with their findings, she promised that she would take vigorous action. We will use all of the tools at our disposal, including withholding federal funds, to ensure that women are free from sexual violence, Ms. Ali said. That's when her office crafted the now infamous Dear Colleague letter. And in April of 2011, she sent it out to all of the colleges and universities receiving federal funds. The letter outlined details of guidelines on taking draconian steps to fight what she called a plague of sexual violence. Ali's letter advised schools to determine guilt by the lowest standard, a preponderance of evidence, and it instructed them to take measures to minimize the burdens on complainants, but didn't say a word about the rights of the accused. The Dear Colleague letter wreaked havoc. Within the next year, 90 schools were being investigated by the Office of Civil Rights for violations of Title IX's sexual assault policies. Terms like trigger warning, rape culture, and yes means yes or affirmative consent became vogue. Universities as prestigious as MIT and Harvard were being sued for their faulty sexual assault policies. Suddenly, every college and university in the country had to put in place these policies and adhere to these standards for fear of being sued and losing federal funds. The meme of rape culture had been born. If you notice, the arc of this story is very similar to what happened in 1969-70 with Bernie Sandler and Representative Edith Green, where a politician took a minor story and made it into a national crusade that affected law and public policy. Miss Ali's Dear Colleague letter was vigorously backed by the Obama administration. In fact, you could hear a lot of what the Dear Colleague letter said and what the Obama administration repeated, like 1 in 5 college women are sexually assaulted every year, or that sexual assault is rampant on college campuses, and is what happened in the 70s. You see that this yes means yes meme and rape culture meme is starting to leak out into the wider general population all over the world. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme.
We're going to spend the next few minutes on a problem college campuses have been facing for a long time now, yet the statistics continue to be chilling. A study funded by the U.S. Department of Justice estimates that 1 out of 5 college women will be sexually assaulted. Usually there's alcohol involved. NPR's investigative unit teamed up with journalists at the Center for Public Integrity for this look at how schools and the government agency that oversees them handle these cases. NPR's Joseph Shapiro reports.
When a woman is sexually assaulted on a college campus, her most common reaction is to keep it quiet. Laura Dunn says she stayed quiet about what happened in April of 2004, her freshman year at the University of Wisconsin.
I always thought that rape was when, someone got attacked by a stranger and you had to fight back.
That night, Dunn was drinking so many raspberry vodkas that they cut her off at the frat house party. Still, she knew and trusted the 2 men who took her back to a house. That's where she says they raped her as she passed in and out of consciousness.
I guess I didn't want to believe what actually happened.
It just didn't make sense with the way she saw her life. For one thing, she had a boyfriend. They'd been dating for 4 years.
We're getting close to marriage. We had been waiting together. And so I was still a virgin, and it just didn't fit with what I wanted my life to be and what I'd planned my life to be. So I just kind of pushed it to the side, said, this is this bad incident that happened, and it was just a mistake. We were all drunk, and I just chose to, put it there.
She focused on her schoolwork, but she couldn't sleep. She lost weight. She broke up with her boyfriend without ever telling him about the attack. And she didn't report it. 15 months later, she was sitting in class. The professor was talking about how, in wartime, rape is used as a weapon of terror.
And this professor, who I'll forever respect, stopped the lecture and said, I want to talk about rape on this campus.
The professor said that over 80% of victims stay silent.
She said, I want you to know that this has happened in my class to my students, and that there is something you can do about it, and there is someone you can talk about it with. And she told me about the dean of students, and after hearing, about rape, I just decided, I know it was rape, and now I know that there's something I can do about it. And so the moment that lecture let up, I walked across to the dean of students' office, and I reported that day. Dear Ms. Dunn, on August 8, 2006, the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, received your complaint of discrimination on the basis of sex filed against the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
By the time Dunn reported to campus officials, one of the men she accused had graduated. The other said the sex was consensual. The University of Wisconsin took 9 months to investigate, then decided against punishment. As a last resort, Dunn asked the U.S. Department of Education to find that the university had failed in its responsibility to act promptly, and to end the sexual harassment she faced being on campus with her alleged attacker. This anti-harassment law is among the strongest tools for enforcement at the Education Department. Few women know to use it, and when they do, the department rarely acts. Between 1998 and 2008, it ruled against just 5 universities out of 24 complaints. That's according to records obtained through the Freedom of Information Act by the Center for Public Integrity. There was no punishment in those cases, simply guidance on how to improve campus procedures. Presented with those findings, Russell Alley, the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, says her office is stepping up outreach to students so they know their rights, and assistance to schools so they know their responsibilities.
We want them to get training. We want to provide some help so that the adults and the students alike can ensure that this plague, it's really become a plague in this country, begins to diminish.
The Education Department official says she's willing to take steps not used by her predecessors, to withdraw federal funding from offending schools and refer cases to the Department of Justice for possible prosecution. Laura Dunn is a teacher now. She writes the next day's lesson on the blackboard.
Most days students will be able to find interior angles of triangles.
2 years after Laura Dunn graduated, a thick document came in the mail to her apartment. It was the finding by the Department of Education.
I went straight to the conclusion.
It said the University of Wisconsin, despite taking 9 months on the case, had acted properly. Defeated, Dunn didn't read on. She threw the papers on the top of a pile of other documents in the corner of her bedroom.
I could have fought it again, and it could have appealed, But that would have meant I would have had to read it. And at that point in my life, just reading it, I just didn't even want to. I did not want to read the ugly things that people said.
But Laura Dunn is no longer silent. She's a leader in a national grassroots campaign to get rape survivors to speak out in public. Joseph Shapiro, NPR News.
The media is making college rape culture worse. College sexual assault is a very real problem, but news organizations and government bureaucrats do victims no favors when they exaggerate its prevalence. The frenzy over college sexual assault now sweeping the nation was triggered by a specific event. In 2010, a small team of investigative journalists published a report revealing, so they claimed, an epidemic of college rape. The report was a jumble of highly selective reporting and dubious statistics, as we shall see. But the reporters spread the news far and wide, and no one thought to question their accuracy. Federal officials were electrified by the findings and launched a draconian crusade. The term rape culture, previously limited to gender theory seminars, slowly found its way into the national lexicon. Before long, otherwise sensible people came to believe that Yale, Swarthmore, and the University of Michigan were among the most dangerous places on earth for young women. Dozens of falsely accused young men were subject to kangaroo court proceedings and expelled from college. By 2014, the panic produced outbursts of fanaticism. A young woman carried a mattress around Columbia in an attempt to expel a classmate who was found not responsible for sexually assaulting her. Students demanded trigger warnings in classes at Harvard Law School. An angry mob vandalized the house of a falsely accused University of Virginia fraternity. And it all began in 2010. That year, reporters at National Public Radio teamed up with the left-leaning journalism organization Center for Public Integrity to produce and promote a 104-page investigative reporting series entitled Sexual Assault on Campus, A Frustrating Search for Justice. The executive director of CPI, Bill Buzenberg, summed up the plight of millions of young women on campus in a single word: nightmare. According to the report, serial predators are roaming free on college campuses. The occasional victim who finds the courage to report her attack is unlikely to secure justice. More often than not, she will be re-victimized by invasive, humiliating, and futile proceedings. Should she turn to the Office for Civil Rights, the federal agency responsible for monitoring the Title IX equity law, she is likely to be thwarted once again. The report depicts the OCR as a lazy, feckless watchdog that leaves students at risk. Exhibit A is the story of Laura Dunn. On the evening of April 4th, 2004, according to the NPR CPI version of events, Dunn, then a freshman and a member of the crew team at the University of Wisconsin, consumed so many raspberry vodkas at a crew party that the student bartenders refused her more drinks. She left with two young men she trusted from her team. They planned to go to another party, but decided to make a quick stop at one of the men's apartment. According to Dunn, once they arrived, her teammates raped her as she fell in and out of consciousness. For many months, she tried to dismiss the evening as just a mistake. Still, she couldn't sleep. She lost weight. She dropped out of crew. 15 months later, Dunn attended a philosophy class where the professor was discussing how rape is a weapon of war. The professor suddenly stopped the lecture and turned to the students and told them she knew many of her students had been raped, and she assured them they could do something about it. A tearful Laura Dunn told NPR's Joseph Shapiro what happened next. The moment that lecture let out, she said, I walked across to the dean of students' office, and I reported that day. She also reported the alleged rape to the campus police. The investigation did not go well for Dunn. Because she reported the assault nearly a year and a half after the event, one of the men had already graduated. The other insisted the encounter had been consensual. And since there were no witnesses or evidence, both the police and the university dropped the case. Dunn felt betrayed. Not only did her attackers go unpunished, the university failed to protect her from retaliation for filing the charge. According to Dunn, while the case was under investigation, she ran into the remaining attacker at a fraternity party, who frightened her with violent outbursts and a warning. "My parents are Harvard attorneys. You won't win." Determined to fight an egregious injustice, she filed a Title IX sexual discrimination complaint with the Office for Civil Rights. Dunn accused the University of Wisconsin of multiple violations, including subjecting her to a hostile environment and failing to provide a prompt and equitable resolution of her case. But in 2008, 4 years after the original incident, she received an 18-page letter from the Department of Education with the verdict. Based on its investigation, OCR determined that there is insufficient evidence to substantiate the allegations made in the complaint. Dunn was stunned to find the OCR siding with the university. "The message they are sending victims," she told the NPR CPI team, "is that sexual assault is not something they take seriously." The NPR CPI report created a sensation. There had been news stories about campus rape before, but never by such a distinguished team of investigators. Findings were widely and uncritically reported and won multiple journalism prizes, including a Peabody Award, as well as the Robert F. Kennedy Award for Justice and Human Rights Reporting, and the Dart Award for Excellence in the Coverage of Trauma. But the greatest triumph was described by Laura Dunn on her website. The most important result of all this was that the U.S. Department of Education paid attention. Rusalyn Ali, a little-known Education Department official, was galvanized by the NPR CPI findings, and she was singularly situated to act. As the newly appointed Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights and head of the OCR, she was in charge of enforcing Title IX. When the NPR CPI team presented her with the Dunn case and other findings, Ali promised action. "We will use all of the tools at our disposal, including withholding federal funds, to ensure that women are free from sexual violence." The Secretary, Ali, made good on her word. On April 4th, 2011, she sent her now famous Dear Colleague letter to colleges across the nation, providing detailed guidelines on the draconian steps colleges should take to fight what she called a plague of sexual violence. Ali's letter advised schools to determine guilt by the lowest standard, a preponderance of evidence, and it instructed them to take measures to minimize the burdens on complainants, but didn't say a word about the rights of the accused. Ali's Dear Colleague letter was announced at a special ceremony in Durham, New Hampshire. Both Vice President Joe Biden and Education Secretary Arne Duncan were present. So was Laura Dunn, who had been invited as a VIP guest of Biden. The date of the Dear Colleague letter had a special significance, April 4th, the anniversary of Laura Dunn's alleged assault in 2004. As she would tell the Christian Science Monitor, "It was my justice." The Dear Colleague letter created havoc. But before describing that havoc, let's check some facts. Dunn agreed to make her records public as a condition of being part of the NPR CPI investigation. The 18-page letter she received from the OCR publicly available. It gives a detailed summary of notes taken by the University of Wisconsin deans as well as the local police detective. A freelance reporter, Derek Rose, has pointed out it tells a very different story from the one we heard from Shapiro on NPR's Morning Edition or from CPI? Crap. The Dear Colleague letter created havoc, but before describing that havoc, let's check some facts. Dunn agreed to make her records public as a condition of being a part of the NPR CPI investigation. The 18-page letter she received from the OCR is publicly available. It gives a detailed summary of notes taken by University of Wisconsin deans as well as the local police detective. As freelance reporter Derek Rose has pointed out, it tells a very different story from the one we heard from Shapiro on NPR's Morning Edition or from the CPI report. To wit, when Dunn first spoke to the dean, 15 months after the alleged rape, she said that a portion of the sexual encounter was consensual. A few days later, when she spoke to the campus police detective, Dunn said twice she did not remember being raped by one of the men, the one still on campus. She found out about it only when the men told her what happened the next day. She also told the detective that in the months after the alleged rape that she went twice to one of the men's residence where they engaged in consensual physical contact. On one of these occasions, both of the alleged assailants were at the apartment, and they all watched television together. None of these details were mentioned in the NPR CPI report. The anomalies continue. The NPR CPI team faulted the University of Wisconsin staff for dragging the case out for 9 months, enough time for an enraged encounter, as related above, between the accuser and one of the accused men. According to the CPI team, when Dunn ran into the young man at the fraternity party, he stalked and threatened her. But Dunn told the police detective that she had initiated the encounter, and when he walked away, she followed him into another room because she knew he wanted to talk to her. She also admitted that she hugged him, no mention of threats. The young man's version comports with the police report, but he adds that when Dunn approached him, he was alarmed, pulled away, and told her he was afraid she would fabricate more lies. When Dunn started to scream and cry, he fled. The NPR CPI report gives the impression that the university violated federal law by taking 9 months to resolve Dunn's complaint. But according to the OCR letter, Dunn herself delayed the process by insisting the official assigned to review her case be replaced. Dunn found her to be too adversarial and accusing. Not only that, she was Hispanic. As Dunn explained to university officials, her own mother was Hispanic, and she was experiencing transference of tensions. The Hispanic official recused herself, and a new investigator took over. These details do not prove that Dunn's teammates did not assault her, and it is possible the deans and the investigators at her university failed her in some way. But the case is far murkier than the NPR CPI team let on. Anyone listening to NPR's Morning Edition on February 24, 2010, not only heard the sanitized version of the Dunn case, they also heard the chilling statistic. A study funded by the U.S. Department of Justice estimates that 1 out of 5 college women will be sexually assaulted. This comes from the 2007 Campus Sexual Assault Study, commissioned by the National Institute of Justice, but as critics have noted, it was based on an online survey with a low response rate, vaguely worded questions, and a non-representative sample of college women. The best study available at the time of the NPR CPI report was the Bureau of Justice Statistics 2003 Violent Victimization of College Students, which shows that approximately 1 in 40 college women is a victim of rape or assault over the course of 4 years. Assaults include verbal threats as well as unwanted sexual groping and fondling. More recent BJS data suggests the figure to be 1 in 53, far too many, but a long way from 1 in 5. And according to the BJS, 80% of these victims never report the crime. That is a genuine problem we need to address. Instead, NPR and CPI diverted attention to a phantom rape epidemic encompassing 20% of female college students. The NPR CPI team not only exaggerated the number of victims, it promoted the idea that any male undergraduate implicated in a campus sexual assault is likely to be an incorrigible repeat offender. On March 4th, 2010, a little more than a week after the initial report on Laura Dunn's case, NPR's Morning Edition ran a segment called Myths That Make It Hard to Stop College Rape. Steve Inskeep and Joseph Shapiro told listeners about the new research that may cause people to rethink what they believe about sexual assault on college campuses. They were referring to the work of David Lissack, a co-author who concluded that the college officials are dangerously wrong when they assume that young men deemed guilty of sexual assault by a campus disciplinary committee are decent young men who made a mistake because of too much alcohol or miscommunication. These are not individuals who need some counseling, stern warnings, or temporary probation. Lissack warned, "These are predators," he said on NPR. For a 2002 study on campus rapists, Lissack analyzed questions distributed to male passersby in a busy pedestrian area at the UMass Boston campus. Those who returned them, 1,882 over a period of 7 years, were paid $3 or $4. 120, or 1 in 16, admitted to committing acts that met the legal standard of rape or attempted rape. More than half of this group admitted to raping more than once and confessed to crimes such as choking an intimate partner, deliberately burning a child, or forcing a child to perform oral sex. In her excellent critique of Lissack's study, Slate's Emily Yof points out that the participants were hardly typical. Most college students are aged 18 to 24. Lissack's subjects were 18 to 71. UMass Boston is an urban commuter school with no campus housing and a 4-year graduation rate of 15%. Lissack admitted to Yof that his study probably needed to be replicated on a more traditional campus. "I taught philosophy at UMass Boston in the early 1980s. Things may be different today, but at that time, most of my students were adults with full-time jobs, and more than a few had been in jail. Their crimes, however, were more in the direction of bar fights and stealing cars, not sociopathic predation. Because Lissack's results are based on a non-random, self-selected sample of students, we cannot be sure of their relevance, even to UMass Boston." I contacted 2 other lead reporters, Kristen Lombardi and Joseph Shapiro, to hear their side of the story. I first asked Lombardi why her report so confidently asserts the much disputed 1 in 5 sexual assault number. She agreed the figure was controversial, but she said it was not critical to the report. She recalled it coming up only once, and that was in the introduction, written by someone who did not do the reporting. In fact, the statistic appears 5 times in the report and is used strategically to establish the urgency and the scope of the campus assault crisis. When I inquired about the report's account of the Dunn's case, she assured me it had been thoroughly fact-checked. But shouldn't readers have known about the complications, such as Dunn's further sexual and social encounters with her alleged rapist? Lombardi seemed to be unfamiliar with the contents of the OCR letter and explained that she had not written that part of the report. She suggested that I call her colleague, Christian Jones, the author of the section on Laura Dunn. Jones had read the OCR letter, but she didn't think that Dunn's subsequent consensual encounters with her alleged attackers were worth mentioning. She had heard from people who are experts that victims are often in shock and they sometimes try to feign normalcy by continuing to socialize with their attackers. She could not recall any names of the experts, but in a follow-up email, she suggested I contact David Lisak. I did, but so far he has not replied to my queries. I also attempted to speak to Joseph Shapiro at NPR, but he declined in a polite email. Our policy is to let the stories speak for themselves. NPR and the Center for Public Integrity are well-respected news organizations. They were alerting Secretary Ali to a catastrophe. Millions of women were sexually assaulted by ruthless criminals, and both college officials and the Office for Civil Rights were frustrating their quest for justice. The Secretary was already planning to make changes in OCR protocols for campus assault cases. But once these reporters presented her with their nightmare scenario, nothing short of drastic action would do. As Christian Labarty would later tell a reporter, since the Center for Public Integrity series ran, OCR is much more aggressive. The aggression came in the form of Ali's Dear Colleague letter of April 4th, 2011, which created a national sensation. Colleges rushed to meet the new requirements. They revamped their disciplinary committees and hired the Title IX officers to run the programs with Orwellian-sounding names like the Office for Sexual and Gender-Based Dispute Resolution. Political leaders, including President Obama, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and Senator Claire McCaskill, propagated the 1 in 5 statistic and demanded action. Soon a dizzying number of sexual assault task forces, listening sessions, toolkits, commission reports, and laws materialized. Journalists such as Vox's Ezra Klein joined the frenzy. Mesmerized by the 1 in 5 statistic, Klein defended harsh campus policies that he acknowledged would punish the innocent. Men, he said, need to feel the cold spike of fear when they begin a sexual encounter. Jonathan Chait spoke for civil libertarians everywhere when he questioned Klein's endorsement of false convictions as a strategy. This is a conception of justice totally removed from the liberal tradition. By 2014, OCR was investigating 90 colleges for possible Title IX violations in their handling of sexual assault complaints. Campuses were in full panic mode, with calls for censorship and trigger warnings for sensitive material. At last count, 56 young men found responsible for sexual misconduct were suing their schools, alleging that they were denied due process and fair treatment in Star Chamber proceedings. When Rolling Stone published its apocryphal article about a sadistic and premeditated fraternity gang rape at the University of Virginia, many who should have known better took it seriously. It was a gothic fantasy nurtured by specious statistics, poorly designed studies, and panic. The writers and editors at Rolling Stone are to blame for publishing the story, but it was the investigative journalists at NPR and the Center for Public Integrity who made it all seem real. Let me say this respectfully, and with as much clarity as I can. You do not know my work. Those are the words of an anonymous student affairs officer in an open letter published by Inside Higher Ed soon after he received the Dear Colleague letter. The frustrated official is addressing both Secretary Ali and the NPR CPI journalist who inspired her. He and his colleagues have to cope with ambiguous she said, he said cases like Laura Dunn's every day. The cases he manages, said the official, are enormously complex, full of truths lies, reversals, angry parents, hungry lawyers, and empowered supporters. Before Ali's Dear Colleague letter, clearly criminal cases were typically turned over to the police. Campus officials are not detectives. They cannot adjudicate family rapes any more than they can murder cases. But for confusing, volatile, evidence-free cases like Dunn's, the old system allowed school officials to deploy their skills as educators or counselors. They might send the young man for alcohol counseling or put them on social probation. The Dear Colleague letter tacitly assumes the truth of Lisak's predator theory, so it rules discretion out of order and mandates strict legal procedures and harsh punishments. The Inside Higher Ed author says he wrote anonymously because in the current environment, to protest the new rules publicly invites changes of being soft on sexual assault by the media and by victims' rights groups. It could also provoke an investigation by the OCR. The writer protests that the voices of reasonable and experienced professionals have been left out of the debate. But Laura Dunn's voice is fully present. Not only was she Biden's honored guest at the April 4th, 2011 event releasing the Dear Colleague letter, she would later serve on a White House task force on sexual assault and be recognized for her advocacy on the U.S. Senate floor. On April 13th, Dunn and Lombardi were guests on Diane Ram's show. When asked about her assault, Dunn changed her story yet again. The 15-month delay had become about half a year. Her sudden realization that she had been raped no longer took place in a class with a feminist professor talking about rape as a weapon of war, but rather in an amazing educational program on campus that talked about alcohol-facilitated sexual assault. Dunn now runs Serve Justice, an advocacy group for rape survivors. She was one of the experts cited in the Rolling Stone UVA rape story. After the tale unraveled and Rolling Stone issued an apology, Dunn defended the original story and denounced doubters as rape denialists. The journalists at NPR and CPI painted a false picture of campus life. That picture inspired Ali to take aggressive action, which created havoc in the media, at the White House and in Congress, and on campuses across America. In the current environment, anyone critical of the new sexual assault policies risks being denounced as a sexual assault enabler. Large numbers of professors, deans, and college presidents are privately dismayed by the OCR zealotry, but most have run for cover. An honorable exception exists. In the 28 Harvard Law School professors who issued a statement on October 15th challenging the moral and legal foundations of the OCR policies. They noted that in a free and democratic society, the goal is not to do everything possible to eliminate all traces of what can be characterized as sexual abuse. The goal must be to address sexual abuse while at the same time respecting the rights of the accused, as well as the privacy and autonomy of romantic relationships. One of the signatories, Elizabeth Bartholet, an expert on civil rights and family law as well as a feminist, made a powerful "have you no shame, Senator" observation. I believe that history will demonstrate the federal government's position to be wrong, that our society will look back on this time as a moment of madness. Rape crisis activists believe this madness serves a worthy purpose. It dramatizes a real problem. Whatever the numbers, far too many women are being harmed. As Ezra Klein says, Ugly problems don't always have pretty solutions. But this is exactly wrong. We know from objective research, and some of us know from experience, that sexual assault, although not an epidemic, is a serious problem on campus, and victims, too, often suffer in silence. But hysteria over a rape culture sheds no light and produces no solutions. Panic breeds chaos and mob justice. It claims innocent victims, undermines social trust, and distracts attention from genuine cases of abuse. Pity, wrath, heroism fill them, but the power of putting two and two together was annihilated. These words are from E.M. Foster's 1924, A Passage to India. He is describing the panic among good citizens following a highly dubious rape accusation. But he could have been talking about the current hysteria over campus rape culture. The frenzy will die down when the stories of falsely accused become too much for the public to bear. Eventually, the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, the President, Senators Gillibrand and McCaskill, and even the Ezra Kleins of the world will recover the ability to add 2 plus 2. But our detour into madness might never have happened had those investigative journalists at NPR and the Center for Public Integrity resisted their nightmare narrative and just reported the truth.